should I? How did the presentation work here?
With Zoom?
Yeah, so I need to join that as well.
I can join on the laptop.
Okay.
Without presenting to the screen.
Did you join to the meeting?
Oh. I said I could, I didn't. What's the right? Big.
What are you looking at?
Sharing the notes.
I put your notes in.
I hadn't shared it with the group yet.
Yeah, Quat is asking for permissions.
Yeah.
It's already had the red a shared externally notification, so I told it was like the share was open, so
That's fine.
Okay, it seems like it's going to be just you and me.
And Liam.
I don't see him in the users list.
See a participant.
I'm mostly lurking.
Hello. Sorry, for some reason you're not showing up on my list. Oh, there you are. Okay. It was just black. Sorry.
Yeah, my laptop doesn't like me putting my camera on. The fan gets very angry.
Okay, then we can have a quick sync up on this. So just for status for myself, I actually started implementing Control-Z in Pilot, which is essentially a nice way to expose debugging information in our binaries. Mixer already has it. So I did the first phase. The second phase is actually making some modifications to Control-Z itself so that we can expose arbitrary collections. And I'm going to do that to expose pilots on configuration collection. So that's coming up soon. So we also participated in a bunch of discussions around the gRPC-based protocol for config delivery to components. And separately, I also started some discussions here about maybe trying to support non-etcd backends for the API server. So I think this is going to be useful in a couple of scenarios. So that's pretty much it for me. Jason?
Yeah. So working on the config distribution piece for what Galley would, how Galley could deliver configuration to components. We also had a discussion with the networking team about how they would like to consume configuration, what API mechanism they would like, and how their data model would look. There's a doc linked in the notes to capture some of that discussion. I think there's general alignment with what the networking team is thinking for pilot and what we're planning for Galley. So there's a few loose ends around what that protocol would look like to satisfy Galley's requirements, but overall it's making progress.
Okay, I'm gonna write essentially on behalf of Martin. So we've been discussing about how to do service config, like the higher level configuration. So he's spelunking into the current configuration pieces and the attribute model. We run into a couple of issues that are like fundamental to our system. Mainly, on one side, So on one side, on the networking side, we are using higher level concepts such as virtual service to do authoring, whereas on the mixer side, what we have is low level constructs like what he calls this physical services, and the physical or topology based information to write policies with, and there's an impedance mismatch. So he is right now he has written a document and trying to come up with a solution to reconcile these. All concepts. Let's see. Okay. That's pretty much it, I think, for this meeting. Oh, hey, Spike, welcome. So we were just discussing about like the status, and one major thing that we have this week is essentially we are having a discussion about having a gRPC-based protocol to be able to distribute configuration to different components. So
that's why I'm here to hear about that.
Okay. Yeah, you wanna dive deeper into that?
I can.
Okay.
I don't know if you wanted to finish what you were covering.
No, I think we're done.
Okay. So Oz and I are already kind of up to speed on this. Liam and Spike, I think. Oh, more people are joining too. Okay. So I guess I'll go into a bit more detail. So what we want to do in the config working group is have some consistent way to deliver config from Galley to components in Istio. That would be pilot, mixer, and any other. I guess maybe Citadel, maybe not. That is not immediately dependent on the Kubernetes API server. One of the motivations was to have a bit better layering between components and the environment that they run in. It should make it easier to test and then develop locally, but also integrate in different environments. There's also various things we want to address at the same time with better support for versioning of config, for sharding of config, that would include canarying as well. So there's one doc that we were going to review last week, but we postponed it because it wasn't really ready to be reviewed yet. For overall config distribution, which it's linked someplace in our mailing list. This last week we had a discussion with the networking team to see what they would like post 1.0 for their config ingestion model. And that's what the notes that I pulled up here cover. The basic idea is that we'd like to have, for components to consume config through a watch-like API, it could look similar to the XDS API that Envoy supports. And they all start looking the same once you make modifications to suit our requirements. A key takeaway from the networking discussion was that Pilot really has two different classes of config. There's fairly static config, virtual service gateways and destination roles, and the things that are much more highly dynamic within the service discovery. And that however they consume config, they like to be able to consume those possibly from different sources because they have different characteristics, different SLOs. I think the networking group is keen on using ADS or an aggregate delivery stream to consume their configuration, and they're interested in consuming not only from different servers for the static and more dynamic configuration, but also multiple dynamic sources. So this gets into the multi-cluster work that they're planning to do. So essentially, Pilot is consuming configuration from many sources. But at least we could try to converge on the mechanism that they're using for that consumption. So that it's just, maybe it's just ADS for everything, and they're looking at Galley, they're looking at other peer pilots, maybe there's other servers that people write in the community. Yeah, so there's some key, what else to address here? Yeah, I mean, that's the basic idea.
What does it mean when they say they're going to use ADS? Does that mean that they're going to use ADS as a framework and define new resources that are going to be exchanged, or they're going to literally just use the existing kind of Envoy APIs?
This is a good question, and the simple answer is yes and yes, which was super confusing when I heard it. But they want to use, so Pilot would expose ADS to envoys. So that would be LDS, RDS, CDS, EDS. Pilot might also, I guess they have some plan to have like a tiered caching scheme where Pilot could generate that same data but serve it to other pilots to distribute already kind of pre-computed Envoy configuration. So a kind of a caching pilot might consume Envoy resources.
So this is just a scale out kind of
so it could be a
use case?
Right, but also, so that's the Envoy's version of ADS. But at the same time, how do we deliver Istio config to pilots? And in that case, it would be using the ADS framework, which is just a subscription model where the client watches a set of resources through a request, and it can enact those. There's resources that it receives from the server. In that case, the resources in the gRPC stream would be the virtual service destination role and gateway that we have today. So it's sort of yes to both of your answers, but from different sources. Which is, so I think it's confusing to me because if you just say ADS, I'm thinking like literally the Envoy resources, listeners, and clusters, which is true, but we also, I think, want to use the XDS protocol or parts of that protocol or that scheme for the Istio config, the Istio networking config that we have today. And I guess also would cover authentication, the other config that we're currently consuming through CRDs today in Pilot. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, it does.
Yeah, so they're definitely better wording here to differentiate the two. I was trying to push them on that, but we'll come up with something so you know when we say ADS what we're actually talking about, or which part of ADS we're talking about. I think there we have an aspiration that we would reduce the number of ways Pilot can consume config. Today, service registry, well, on the config side, there's files, CRDs, there's an in-memory version. This would be a fourth. I think over time, we'd like to reduce that to as few as possible. So aspirationally, a single source of it for consuming Istio config, but that may take a while to get to. And we may end up having maybe two for a while until everything is battle tested.
And the long-term vision is that Galley will be responsible for Istio config, but will not be responsible for service discovery.
Yeah, I mean, there's depends who you talk to, right? Yeah. So there are.
No, I'm talking to you.
You're talking to me. Well, so my understanding is there are some users that are very sensitive to the latency involved in the end-to-end service discovery path, and what we have today with an in-memory service aggregation is it's one less network hop. And so in that case, if you wanted to externalize that, there's a lot of issues that have to be discussed if that's a possibility.
But I think it's probably fair to say that it would be possible to push service configuration to Pilot through an external means, which Galley could be.
It could be, right? But it wouldn't be the only.
Yes,
I think that's the key is there's this. You could draw a nice diagram where everything comes through Galley, and maybe that's one viable model. But there are use cases where definitely short term that's not possible, and longer term there's performance and benchmarking that need to be done to see whether that's actually becomes a real thing or not. So one way to look at it is the Istio config that we have today with virtual services, destination roles, gateways. Oh, there's also a service entry, and if Galley or another kind of equivalent component is serving service entry, that is building the service discovery information within Pilot. So you could use that exclusively if you wanted to. I think that's a good goal, but it wouldn't preclude somebody from using the built-in aggregate service registry that Pilot has today. Ultimately, there's not much we can do to control that from the config working group. That's driven a lot by the networking team. So at least we just like to provide that as an option.
All right. Yeah. All right, folks. I think this covers it.
If there's Spike or any listeners online, if there's input that, well, now would be the time to gather it. So there's a note doc here, which is just from a meeting, small discussion we had the other day. There's a larger config distribution doc that I have that I'm going to go and update based on this discussion. That might be a better place to capture any feedback you have. But it'd be good to capture that soon because the plan is within the next, before 1.0, we'd like to have a fairly concrete idea of what we're going to build and actually have a lot of prototyping done so that we can do this in an efficient way. We're not designing for the next 4 months.
So I would say it would be nice if the framework that we use to communicate between Galley and Pilot was the same as the framework that we use to communicate with Galley and other Istio components.
Yeah.
I haven't really thought about the ramifications for components like Mixer and Citadel and stuff like that. Are there any sort of knee-jerk reaction to say like, well, no, ADS isn't going to work for those kind of components? ADS, the framework, shall we say?
No, there are changes we want to make to XDS or ADS, whatever we want to call it. So we're looking at this from the Mixer side as well. So ideally, we'd like to have an abstraction that works for everybody, but we need to look at some concrete examples to do that. Mixer should work with some changes to XDS. So XDS doesn't, right now you can't do incremental loading. You're delivering the full state of the world, which is okay for small clusters, but doesn't scale well. there's a plan to address that on the Envoy side, to do incremental loading and lazy loading of config. So we'd likely copy that. It would also be useful to have a means to provide some sort of atomic delivery of config across resource types, which Envoy doesn't use right now, but Mixer would find useful. What I mean by that is, so the XDS is, there's a separate request response pair per type. So it'd be something, so for Mixer, you'd have a separate separate virtual stream for rules, handlers, and instances. But in Mixer's case, we want those to be delivered as a group and then not adopted incrementally. So there's some things you can do to where you basically have a continued bit in your request. And you can say, I'm delivering a sequence of responses, and here's the final one in that sequence.
Begin transaction.
Yeah. So there's a watch API that I did a prototype with, and that API inherently allows for atomic delivery and grouping. There's grouping mechanism. The XDS doesn't, but we could add that. That could be an optional thing for components. If Mixer needs it, we use that. But Pilot, we could use that on the Galley side. We could try to sequence things and say these should be adopted as a group, but whether or not Pilot uses it that way or just applies them incrementally is TBD. Yeah, so to your original question is, yeah, we're considering multiple components. We haven't really looked at Citadel as much yet, but it could be. There's probably a lot more security things to sort out there, depending on what we're delivering or what's being distributed.
All right.
That's all I have.
Okay. Any more questions? Any more agenda items? All right. Going once, going twice. All right. Thank you, folks. And we'll try to kind of keep this meeting as a way to just keep everything updated rather than having a just a dry status run or like some official reviews. I think this would be a better format to dry the meetings at, like having like a semi cozy discussions about what we are doing. So if you guys have any feedback on the format of the meeting as well, let me know, and we can adjust. All right, with that, I'll say goodbye.